Hello. So I'm just going to cover these elements here because it's quite an interesting area, the idea of strings, because strings are all becoming worn out, and there's a lot of conversation about what to replace and what not to replace and how to replace what there is. I haven't got my notes here either. Still come up. Right, so I'm going to wing this one. So looking at the description of string, the colour of them, the finish, whether it should be aged or not, a lot of them are. String patterning, how to replace, examples and some examples of types of string replacement. So I'm going to whip through, I've got a lot of slides, I thought I'd make it quite pictorial. So we tend to refer to them as stringed pieces, which they are, but in actual fact the description is actually twine, is what we're looking at. In particular, string is a very different descriptor to twine, so they're strung with twine. And it's something called hard-laid twine. And it's quite easy to get hold of hard-laid twine, but it's not the right type. So if you go and get something from Home Base or something like a Travis Perkins line, it's not correct. It's not the correct cordage. It's a really tight twine that she used, for fisherman's twine really. But so it's quite easy to sort of get the wrong twine. I've got a real stash of Kent twines who've gone out of business now. I've got a lifetime supply. But there are other ones that are also in business still. But the thing to be looking for is hard-laid twine. If you start looking for string, you'll never find it. I also know that the Tate have got a string making machine, and they're looking into making the twine for restringing. Here you can see really clearly the two colours that are generally made, white and then the very dark. And Hepworth really used the very dark ones, but this is quite an interesting discussion now because they look very new and pristine, and there's a real conversation about whether they should do now because they're old pieces. So Kent twines produced mainly, or produced non-waxed types, but a lot of Hepworth strings were waxed, but not all of them. So quite often come across very matte, sort of slightly hairy original stringings. So here you can see hard-laid twine, and it's basically a twine with 3 threads on it. And on the bottom section you see all the original ones. Oh, and the replacement one as well. So you can see there that some of them are quite waxy and hard, like the one on the last bit at the end, and some of them aren't. So you've just got to get the right look for the piece. So what's really important is if you're taking anything apart, is to do a string map, and 2 of those string maps in the middle there, they're original string maps from the Palais, but it's really important where you start your knotting from, because if you knot from one end or from the other, you get a completely different set of how the string is going to lie, so it could lie one way or the other. If you get it wrong, it's really annoying. And if you see there, that's an original string on the left, and that very strange yellow string is what happens if you bleach the dark twine. Obviously, it's completely wrong, but it's interesting to look at it because that bleached ochre colour is quite similar to what you can see now in the original one. I know it's wrong, but it's similar. And my theory is that all these strings that we're seeing now are the really old dark twines that have bleached. And so, we have to question what colour and what look we're going for, because that's the key thing, is how she wanted it to actually look. So there's some more original strings. Again, you see the middle one. It's not at all waxed. It's not even particularly stretched looking. That's one thing she was very emphatic about. Before you use them, you have to really tension the strings. And they are all quite different. And the knots, there are Hepworth knots, but they often change. You can spot a non-Hepworth knot because it's to be completely wrong, but they're not all the same. Like all her other work, it was often different. This is a set of strings from Sculpture with Colour. If you can see the dark area where that arrow is pointing to, that was within the work. So where the strings disappear into the piece, there's been no UV affected. They're really dark. They're the dark twine. So, and then you see above that blue line, there's quite an ochre look, a bit like my weird bleached dark one. So It's an interesting thing because a lot of people want it to look original. And I think there's a value thing here. They think if it's original string, the value is going to be more. Whereas when you have a client who wants a piece to look like it should, they're not so interested in that. It's an interesting discussion, I think, about what we're meant to be replacing, so it's up for discussion. So when you match string, how thick is it? If it's not original, look at the archives, but that's something I'd quite like to have a string bank. We've often talked about having a thing about where we all come together and go, oh, all the curlews, by the way, are this, and all the, you know, and often they're not, they can change, but to have an actual set we can go back to. Measure how much is required and allow extra. Always allow extra. Dye the string, the decided colour, and hang it out. You have to hang it in one long length, because if you even crease it slightly, you think you've got away with it, and then you start to restring and you find slightly different colours. So you've got to have a very long space and do it all in one go. And then when it's wrong, you just start again, and you keep doing it until you've finished. And then if it's meant to be waxed, you wax it. So I normally go up and down the string, up and down the studio, with a large bar of wax going up and down, and then I polish it with a stick, and I burnish it. If it's meant to be, if it's one that's gone. So there we've got a large spool of string for a curlew, and in fact, so the decision there with this one was because the curlew, they wanted it as it was, replaced as it was, but I think it would have been obviously dark red, so we've matched it to the original string that was there, and that's a dog's tooth gold burnishing tool there to give it a final burnish to get those highlights on the string. Yes, so that's just the curlew being restrung. So, and then another thing is, with things like this, when they're strung, they're often strung under tension. So even though you tension the string, they're also under tension. So when you take the string off, they'll just go opening like really wide. And then you've got to make sure they go back to how they should. And you can get that wrong. You've got to have a photograph of that piece, or know that piece, or know the type of piece it is. And for this one, in order for me to get the strings right, I had to put it under a lot of tension. And you can see the quite poor picture on the end. It's an original picture of that particular one on the computer, and measuring the aperture of the opening. And then cutting the knot is always the very last thing. I make lots of people have a look at it first before I cut it. That's another story. Do you replace one string only? I couldn't find my photograph before, but trust me, that bottom string, which is a replacement, was a perfect match. And they're really, this is the biggest string piece I found. It had a huge aperture. It's like, I think it was about 1.5 millimeters wide. The strings is a huge piece. But this particular piece went into very bright sunlight and aged completely differently. So this year, when I go and see this piece, I've got to age down the string now, that dark string, which did completely match it. And now all the original strings have discolored. So. Bonding strings. So sometimes for a client or for expedience, because they can't bear the fact that they're going to lose their string, if that's important to them, I have bonded a couple. I don't do it very often, but that was a bonded one. You have to sort of, someone stuck it with Yoo-hoo, actually, if you can see there in the middle. So is that the right thing to do? Is it the wrong thing to do? Should they all be stripped out and a nice dark red set of strings be put in? Rethreading original strings. So sometimes it's just come unknotted and you can actually thread it through, but it's really tricky to do because if you can see that, that's just screwed in. So it's quite difficult to pull them through, actually through the hole. And those are other examples. Those are all examples of oval form knotting on the back. So you can see the far one is really neat, beautifully finished, and all the others are completely different. So when you look at Hepworth knots, that's what I mean about they change. There's no set standard. Although there are some set standards, like the apertures of the curlews and things, you know, it's changeable. Yes, pre-tensioning the string. Again, if you see on the right, all those strings have to go through that tiny hole and then be knotted, or sometimes not twisted. So at the top, you can see some original knots, and you can see the state of the string there. It's really eroded. There's no way we're going to be able to use that string. It's got to come out. And then if you see where the bits come out at the end, on the far bottom slide, again, you can see how dark it is in the bit that goes through the piece. It's very dark. It's dark brown. Sculpture with colour. So this one here had to have the bottom of it modified, because by the time Hepworth had finished putting the strings through, there was so much string the bottom wouldn't fit back on, which must be really annoying. So the bottom had to be modified for that particular piece to get one string through. And I think with that piece we actually used, again, the original string. We were able to pull enough through to just tie it off. I think what happened, it just went through the hole and we tied a different string onto it to pull the original one through, so it's still all original. So for some people it's really important it's original, but and then obviously another one, but with a whole different knotting system. So she improved the knotting system and managed to get the bottom on. And with that one, it is a replacement string, but I was able to just knot it next to it, so it's a replacement string and you can actually see which one it was. Though obviously we always do reports to show which one is not real. It's another sculpture with colour. This is an interesting one because it has a beautiful little plug made for it, and you undo the plug and inside it you find loads of sawdust and then a tiny little wooden wedge. So when you take the strings out, they're often sort of atrophied inside the ones, and you have to try and poke them out, and that's never good because you could slip if you're using a tool. So I tend to use a drill. It's really frightening, but if you're very careful and you get the whole string out, clear it out from inside. And then with this one has got the proper dark string for it, and because we knew exactly how. Obviously, you take complete records of how it's going to come apart. I had to sort of get them all together and then use the original wedge, pop the wedge in, and then have a coffee and cut the string. When you cut the string, there's no going back because the tension can sag. You have to be really careful, and then fold them all back in, and then pop the plug back in. So that's me really. But the deciding factors of what string to replace: do you match what's there? Do you match an age string and colour? Do you replace all the strings and refresh them? So putting back what was there in colour and wear, so very dark. Would this be in keeping with the type and age of the object? Should this decision be different with the polished work? It's meant to be pristine. Here's a polished work and this is how it's meant to look. So should it remain exactly right? Or should we consider if they're aged pieces and different patinas that they have aged string? And just to replace one missing string, I mean, that's implications, obviously things change. And she seems to say over time, over many things, but then she fluctuates, that the important thing is the finish of the work. However, sometimes she also liked aged things, so it's up for a discussion really. I'm never sure which way to swing. It's always a discussion, and I think it'd be nice to discuss it together. But the only advice she ever gave with strings was to tension them. I just had to put that in. Thank you.